Okay, welcome to 12, Module 3. So last week we kind of just talked about your typical language development. What do we expect? And I just started grading Module 2. If anybody wanted something specific, please let me know. But I think you guys got the gist. Like, what do we expect out of certain age groups as far as language goes? So the prevalence and diagnosis of a language disorder. So a couple different things. The reason why I like doing this, because I'd like you guys to understand, how does your supervisor come up with who has a language disorder and who doesn't. So a couple different things I want to review. Hold on, sorry. Okay, so some keywords. Hopefully you've heard some of these before. So aphasia, TBI, which is traumatic brain injury, autism, autism spectrum disorder, and then stroke. So a lot of times when we talk about autism, we are talking about the scope from kind of one extreme to the next on autism. We usually, a lot of time we don't say ASD, but if you see the acronym, I'll add the acronym ASD, that's autism spectrum disorder. So I'm starting to see that used more than autism by itself, which probably ASD is the more politically correct term. So let's review some autism prevalence. Okay, and actually I need to pull up some even more current. I think there's some current stats, 2018. So I think right now we are still at 1 in 59. I read somewhere 1 in 53, but I'm not sure that that's the most current, but from the CDC, 1 in 59. So that's a high prevalence of autism spectrum disorder. And really, when we look at the scope of ASD, it occurs in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. So it doesn't really target just one SES or one ethnic group. We're really looking across the border, across the whole realm. We're looking at 1 in 59, so that's a really high prevalence. And as I think most of you are familiar, autism spectrum disorder affects boys. So it's 4 times more common in boys than girls. So definitely when we look at just your average developmental delay, 1 in 6 children, has a developmental disability of some type. So that's really at the wide range from mild disability. And mild disability includes, and I hate to say just, I don't like using that word either, just a speech and language impairment. So that goes from only a speech and language impairment to something more on the wide scope, such as autism. So a developmental disability can be the whole range. So if you can just kind of get kind of familiar with how those stats are going up. Now, some people ask about this, just my own, what I see is that really, autism spectrum disorder is so wide, so many people fit the criteria of it. So I don't know. I feel like, everyone's fitting the diagnosis of autism, even though I think a lot of people don't have autism, but have that label. Again, that's my own opinion. That's for the doctors to decide, not for me. But in Arizona, I think it's a big problem because in order to get services, you got to meet one of these criterias. And most of the 3 other ones really require the medical component, where autism is more subjective. So I do think a lot of children get the autism label because they do need services, because they have a developmental disability of some type. Maybe we don't know the whole scope and sequence of it, but definitely they need those services and access to those services. So I have a love-hate relationship with that, because for me as a provider, I feel like anybody who needs it should get it. Not just our children with autism, or not just our children with, say, epilepsy. I say if you have a developmental disorder, you have a need, you should be able to access it. So if you kind of just look at some of the risk factors, and the other problem that I have with autism spectrum disorder is that we're looking at, it tends to occur often in people who have certain genetic or chromosomal conditions. So to me, a lot of times people who have this genetic or chromosomal issue, disability, you know, some kind of issue with their chromosomes, then autism is just the symptom of what that looks like. It's not so much an autism. So for instance, Down syndrome, look at a child with Down syndrome could have sensory issues as well as obviously a speech and language impairment, maybe have some repetitive behaviors, etc. You know, do they really have autism? Do they have some autistic features? Sure. But do I think it's separate of the chromosomal disability? Usually not, in my opinion. But I feel like, I don't know if we're doing the integrity of the diagnosis when we're giving somebody with Down syndrome and autism or Fragile X. So obviously we know Fragile X is a serious chromosomal disability or issue that can cause disabilities. Excuse me, let me rephrase that correctly. And Fragile X definitely can be what I would call mild to severe. And then to have autism too, well, no, I feel like the symptoms of Fragile X kind of fit the criteria of autism. So that's where those comorbid, when you hear that word comorbid, it's used quite a bit, especially when we're looking at diagnosis of very young children who are still developing. So almost half. So the key piece too to look at is when we look at ASD, about half. So when we're looking at just under half, 44% of those children that are identified as autism spectrum disorder can have average to above average intellectual abilities. So looking at autism, it doesn't necessarily imply you have an intellectual disability, because many people with a diagnosis of autism have average to actually above average intellectual abilities. So looking at that, that's kind of something to remember. And then obviously we also know children born to older parents have a higher risk of autism, as well as people who are born prematurely or with a really low birth weight. So, you know, got older parents, you're at risk. You were born premature or really small, have a really low birth weight, you're at high risk. So just looking at the co-occurrence of one or more non-ASD developmental diagnosis is 83%. So that comorbid piece. And then also the co-occurrence of one or more psychiatric diagnoses is 10%. So really, and I do think as I work now with the high school level and really seeing these adolescents who have had a diagnosis of autism, and some of these I've had the pleasure to work with from the time they're 3 to now they're, you know, seniors. I do think that maybe some of these things were really mental illness, but it manifests itself as a symptom of autism when they were younger. So definitely we see that comorbid mental health piece. Also too, when we're looking at kind of if they have autism, but we think there's some mental health piece going on, we shouldn't ignore that because of a diagnosis of autism. So to me, you know, look at the symptoms. We're going to address the symptoms and I don't worry too much about labels. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, for me, I don't really look at what the primary diagnosis is for the most part. It's not that we disregard it, but a lot of times what are the symptoms? They have poor language, poor communication. Let's address that. That's usually our main thing. They have poor pragmatic skills. Let's address that. They have poor intelligibility. They need to be understood so they can communicate more effectively. Let's work on that. So regardless of what primary is, and technically speaking, usually speech and language is not always a primary. There is a small percentage of kids with a primary diagnosis of speech and language impairment, but huge majority of them have other, and then speech is like a secondary. Speech and language impairment is a secondary diagnosis. So just know a lot of times we don't operate on the island of just a speech and language disorder. It's usually more involved than that. So that's, like I said, autism really covers a lot, and we look at the evaluation of language. So when your supervisor goes through an assessment, these are kind of the steps that they go through. So typically, we have a screening, then a comprehensive assessment that's a lot more involved. We look at their medical history, all the concerns, what are they seeing at home? And then obviously we look at some of these other things we have to do: hearing, check out hearing, an oral mechanism exam, and then usually a lot of times we do spoken language testing. And that really looks at kind of those components of language. Literacy can be involved, as well as other, what I would call fringe. So if there's fluency, we might do a stuttering assessment. If there are other kind of voice issues, we might do a voice assessment. So kind of be familiar with the different types of assessment. And usually, and we try our best, we kind of use a component, a dynamic assessment, a standardized assessment. When you look at ethnographic interviewing, really looking at the home and the environment in which the person is from or in. So definitely some of those components kind of, and then you have to synthesize, your supervisor synthesizes all that information together. So for instance, and it's complicated, it's not always just cut and dry. And obviously too, looking at cultural and linguistic considerations. So bilingualism is not a cause of language impairment. So I think that, if you get nothing else out of this class, that really being bilingual is not a disadvantage. It can affect language development in a certain way. A lot of times, as they're developing both language, they're kind of what I would call delayed, or not necessarily at the pace of everybody else. But you're looking at two language systems that a young developing person developing language is navigating between. And then there's other linguistic components that are through either the cultural and ethnic factors, as well as, just their sound systems. Looking at the phonology of the language too can kind of impact some of that. So we definitely have to consider that, because just because someone doesn't speak English doesn't mean we're giving them a speech and language impairment. So just know that's not what your supervisor will do. Most of us, I think, are fairly good at not if someone just has an English issue, we're not calling it a speech and language impairment. Might affect their communication depending on the setting, but that doesn't mean that we are calling them language impaired. They might need some language support. But the practice portal. So I like this site, and a couple different things that we look at. And I don't know why it doesn't come right up, but there's usually, where's the prevalence? Excuse me, I have to find it. And they change these links sometimes. Where is it? Hold on one second. Sorry. One moment. Yeah, it's the incidence and prevalence tab. So maybe I need to go back and find that. Did we see it on this page? It should be on this page. It's usually, see, when I want to find something fast, I can't find it. Okay, I'll have to come back. I will repost the prevalence. So sorry about that.
Is it about autism?
It's, well, that's just, we talk about the prevalence of autism, but there's one just about language disorders. I'll find it. I'll repost it. They like to move stuff around on the ASHA website quite a bit. One more to review, and then we'll go over some of the assignments. So this kind of is more broad when we're looking at, and this is from the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So this is kind of from more agencies. So if you look at between 6 and 8 million people in the U.S. have some form of language impairment. And really what we know, and all the research keeps supporting this. So a lot of research supports that the first 6 months are absolutely crucial and critical. But really, when we look at that window, that language window is the biggest from birth to 3. And so I feel like there's a couple windows, like that first 6 months. And I think that's more about how that connection piece with many of the kids when they come out of the womb, and then that communication piece about their basic needs. And this is more what I would call that primal communication. I need to eat, I'm uncomfortable, I need something. So that crying in response is really critical. I cry and somebody tends to me. And then looking at that exposure window from birth to 3 is critical. And then when we go to that next big window, that 3 to 6 range. And then really when we look at where language capacity is kind of really stabilized is at about 9 or 10. So where your language skills are at there, I mean, I'm not saying it can't improve, but when we're looking at the bulk, like what's your core language skills? Could you maybe improve vocab? Sure. Can you maybe improve some expressive language? Sure. But where's your core language skills at is usually stable about 9 or 10. So that's where the bulk of language intervention should be done. When we're looking at that birth to about 3rd or 4th grade is where you kind of look at where we should spend the most time. And then usually after that, we're working on compensatory skills or, maybe trying to develop a component. But, like I said, that's a topic for another day on what does language intervention look like at certain ages. But and then we look at aphasia. So aphasia was another word we talked about. And this is what happens usually after a traumatic brain injury, some kind of injury in the brain. And then all of a sudden we have, damage to our language areas. And so we acquire aphasia. So usually you're not born with aphasia, you acquire it. So you didn't have a language disability, now all of a sudden you have one. And so when someone has a stroke, that kind of thing, we're usually looking at aphasia. We're looking at 80,000 individuals acquire aphasia each year, and about 1 million people across the US, and probably I would say that's a low estimate, actually have aphasia. A lot of times they have aphasia, but they've been treated, so they're kind of, I don't want to say, I use the word recovered, but they're functioning maybe close to their previous levels. And so you can kind of look at some of the other key pieces here. And then, seizure disorder, we're talking about Landau-Kleffner. Really, a lot of times, anybody with a seizure disorder, we definitely want to monitor because they can lose some skills. So depending on the severity of their seizures. And so you can look at the primary or specific language impairments. And usually I just use SLI, speech and language impairment, as a kind of the category. And definitely whether it's primary or secondary, there's usually a language component in that us as speech therapists are treating. Okay, so hang on. Let's review some other key assignments. So there's an evaluation observation. So on this observation on master clinician, you're watching a SLP do an eval. So just kind of look at that. Pretty sure it's a Goldman Fristo. So it's more, no, maybe it's a PLS. I can't remember. I have to review it. But basically, you know, this might be something your supervisor would do as they're trying to diagnose a speech issue or a language issue, depending on the test. Certain tests are just for speech articulation and certain tests are predominantly for language. And then there's prevalence and diagnosis quiz. So looking at that, review the vocab and really kind of be familiar with the prevalence. So what are the prevalences? I mean, you as a speech therapist should know 1 in 59 are commonly diagnosed with autism. You know, how many kids on average in the US have a developmental disability? So be familiar with some of the prevalence and that vocab piece. And then the reading review summary. So really what we're looking at, there's lots of information in the reading review summary. And really, I want you to kind of do this. So if you do this if you do the reading and review summary, so for those of you who, you know, don't know or haven't said this, and I thought I have, but maybe I haven't, really what I want you to do is do the read and review summary. That will help prepare you for the quiz. So that's really the purpose of the read and review summary is kind of, do you understand this information? If you're not clear, oh, I see it. I hate when I see errors when I'm on teaching. I'm like, oh, I don't see a space on that. So I will fix that. But I'll repost the prevalence and incidence thing on ASHA. So ASHA, when in doubt, if you guys are looking up information and you're wondering what's the reputable source, because I don't know if any of you have noticed, I think sometimes it's hard to judge what's a reputable source and what's not. I can assure you, ASHA is going to be your best reputable source for anything speech and language related. So when in doubt, look what ASHA says. That's going to be your best bet on information anytime you're researching anything for any of our classes in our program. So I will repost that where it talks about the incidence and prevalence. And I do want to tell you, I think sometimes statistics skew things. So for instance, somebody who's diagnosed with autism, they kind of lump that into a communication impairment, even though if maybe that person functionally is doing fine with communication. They might have some other things that are impacting their day-to-day that's, you know, they've addressed their communication issues. They are functional for where they are at. But by default, and there's plenty of kids who have a diagnosis of autism, say it is school-based, that are not getting speech and language services. And so that's also too, just because someone is labeled with something doesn't mean it's always an issue or is necessarily being addressed in a therapeutic component. So just know too, sometimes numbers can skew things, but the good part is this is a good job field. We're not at high risk for being obsolete. And if anything, technology isn't making us obsolete, it's making us more important. So definitely this is a good field. There's a good projection of need. And I feel like each year these things increasing, aphasia, traumatic brain injury, you know, developmental disabilities in a variety of severities, autism. Definitely these things are important. That's good job security. So just some key things. I would definitely do the read and review summary before you do the quiz. I feel like that will help prepare you. And any other questions? And just know when I'm talking about prevalence, I'm usually referring to numbers in the US, but a lot of the statistics do give, you know, in the world, and that's okay too. So if you reference something, if it's just in the US or, you know, worldwide, we have X amount of people, that's okay too. So somebody asked about that, where we're only always looking at US numbers. We're not always looking at US numbers. A lot of times we're looking at North America numbers. I usually will tell you what that number represents. Is this all the people in the United States? Is this all the people in North America? Is this the amount of people worldwide? So there are a couple different reference points on some of those. So just kind of be clear on that too. So sometimes I think when we look at those statistics, it gets a little muddled. So that's the other key piece to look at when we're talking about statistics. So any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you guys for joining me. I just started grading module 2, so I'm trying to always be done with the module from the previous week by Wednesday. So if you have anything else specific or concerns about a certain assignment, please feel free to message me. All righty. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I can't always see the chat when I'm screen sharing. Diane, you say you have a question?
Yeah, the age ranges that you went over on the like developing language, do we need to know the ones that you just stated or the ones that are on the documents?
Just be familiar with them. So obviously autism, you really should know. I will tell you that's going to come up, if it doesn't come up in this class, it is going to come up in several other classes, as well as probably on your exam that you have to take with ASHA. So I definitely want you to know that one, but just have a good idea about some of the language disorder numbers. Like I said, for developmental disabilities, you definitely should know that, as well as what's the prevalence. Like when we talk about aphasia, how many people annually have aphasia? How many people get a new aphasia diagnosis each year? So there was some references to kind of the new diagnoses that occur on a regular basis. The good part with aphasia, a lot of people recover, but once you have aphasia, it's like you always will have aphasia. It doesn't like go away. It's not like a cold or other illness that, oh, we don't have it now. Okay, it's done. It's no, I've had aphasia, but I've recovered, or I'm functioning back to my previous levels. So those are kinds of the things too on some of those acquired language disorders. We definitely are working on that rehab piece of getting them back to pre-aphasia levels, or as close to possible. So some of that can kind of get confusing. So just be aware, is it acquired, or are these things that are congenital? Do these things occur at birth? For instance, someone who all of a sudden had a seizure disorder, they didn't have a seizure disorder, but somehow something happened and it didn't show up till, let's say, later. So I work with a teacher, he never had seizures, and all of a sudden his mid-20s, he started having extensive seizures. Then he started having some significant issues with language, memory, focus. So he kind of got an acquired language disorder from some of these extensive seizures he had. And then definitely he started doing some rehab and working with therapists to, basically wanted to be able to continue his job and keep, what he just graduated for. But that would be like something that was an acquired. He wasn't born with that. So yeah, be clear on that, the difference between acquired and congenital. I don't think it's in this quiz, but it is in later quizzes. So key piece, really, vocab is important. But yeah, just understanding the prevalence. And as a speech therapist, you should have a good idea of how many people are walking around with speech and language disorders. Okay? All right, so thank you guys so much for joining me, and then we will see you next week.
Can I ask you a quick question on assignment? Sorry.
Sure, no, that's fine.
The observation, it's more like on our, how can I say it? What we think about what we're observing. Okay.
Yes, because that's what you're going to do anyway. Like I said, there's some general guidelines that I'm hoping you pick up on, but when we're looking for the long-term, it's not really right or wrong. It's like, did you notice these things? What did you get out of watching? Because that's how you learn to be a therapist, is watching others. So when you do your practicum, it's just working on those observation skills. Because if something seems different to you, or why is she not responding or responding, or he or she, these are the questions I want you to ask. So a couple people asked some questions that I thought were good in their their observation they did. And so on the evaluation observation, I just want you to see what your supervisor might do, because then you're going to get this kid like, okay, I did all these assessments. Here you go. And you're like, well, how did they come up with the fact that this child needed to work on this, or this person needed to work on that? So this is just like, how does your supervisor come to some conclusions for you to understand? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, guys. You guys have a good night.
Thank you.